The purpose of doing this webinar is to help some of our teachers feel more comfortable when you encounter chord symbols that you might not be comfortable deciphering. And once you kind of know the set of kind of rules or how they're built, how they're structured, it's really not difficult to figure them out. And I just want you to have that background because questions inevitably come up from your students, especially when you teach the jazz program. And I hope you're not scared about teaching the jazz program because it's a wonderful program. I don't present any of this to my students about chord building until we are well into the jazz program, Jazz Clue 3, and they're well into, in the way I teach it, level 9 at least, or into the development program before I start doing this with them. Also, for when you do teach the jazz program, this will help you to increase your understanding of the jazz chords, which is a lot of this is geared toward. Also, when you have an understanding of the chords, it allows you to be able to, at some point, create richer solo arrangements, meaning rather than just playing the melody note in the right hand, you can add some beautiful harmonies underneath that using your knowledge of what works with that chord. So I'm going to just dive right in here and start with major scale because chords are built on the major scale. We do cover this in accompaniment level 2, and in case you have never taught this, it does not, the accompaniment 2 program does not immediately follow accompaniment 1. It comes a bit later. In between, you can do accompaniment variations and other things with accompaniment projects, but I personally introduced accompaniment level 2 during level 8. And that's where we really get into the nitty gritty of the theory stuff, the scale and key signature and knowing the key of a song and all that. We do also more advanced accompaniment variations that are more just the rhythmic variations. So this is in the curriculum in your teacher training. We teach this simple formula for finding any major scale. And we call it 2.5, 3.5. And all that really means is you start on a note. So if you're doing a C major scale, you would start on a C. And then you would, the next note is up a whole step, and then up a whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. So there's 2 whole steps and a half step, 3 whole steps and a half step. So that's what the 2.5, 3.5 means. And it's just a simple, quick way to remember, that formula. So let's look at what that means for anybody that might not be real comfortable with this yet. Here's a keyboard and here's the formula. So here's our starting note on C. I think you should be able to see my cursor here. From C, we go up a whole step to D. Up a whole step is E. Up a half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. C is always an easy one to start with because there's no black notes in the C major scale. And you can see how this, this formula lays that out for you. So then you can get the scale notes from applying that formula. So it's just all the white notes. If you're playing a scale, a C scale, you'd start on C and go up C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then you're back to C. Now, the other thing that you have to know about with building chords is that each one of these notes in the scale has a scale degree or number that corresponds to it, and this is very important. So the C is the 1. It's also called the root or the tonic. That's kind of the home base note. And then it's just counting up. It's just counting up the notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then you're back to the 1. It's pretty straightforward. That was a C major scale, all white notes. So let's look at the D major scale. Here's our formula. We start on D, up a whole step, Up a whole step this time goes to the F sharp, up a half step, up a whole step, up a whole step, up a whole step, up a half step. So there are the notes of the D major scale. So we have 2 black notes in this one. And again, we apply those same scale degrees. So if you say, what's the 3 of a D scale? It's an F sharp. Felicity said, why not just use tone, tone, semitone? Is there any benefit to using whole half instead of semitone? I don't know, Felicity, if you are in the United States, but that really is the language that we use. It's just a more prevalent in our musical vernacular. Joan asked, Lori, I know intuitively what the scale is if there are, say, 3 flats, but is there a way to know the 3 flats is key of E flat major? Yes, and that's outside the scope of this webinar, but that is taught in accompaniment level 2. How long do I spend on scale? That is an ongoing conversation. It's not a separate unit per se. It starts in a playing-based manner, and again, that's again kind of outside the scope of this. But scale is something that we do in a playing-based fashion, applicable just to songs that they're learning, like in Time for More Music. So that's all I'm going to say about that right now. Triads, we see that word in our accompaniment level 1 book. A triad is just a chord, a 3-note chord. And in the accompaniment program, we're teaching all 12 major triads, major chord. And any chord is just simply made up of notes from the scale. Often we alter some of them, but just for a basic definition, a chord is just made up of tones of the scale. Chords are based on stacked thirds. If you haven't taught reading notes and are not familiar with interval language, you'll have to come back to that later. But thirds, we'll see them in a moment here, but it's just an interval, a distance between notes. We're just stacking up thirds using the notes of the scale. So this would be a C major chord. This is a C, and then up a third from that, it just sits right on top of it, and then here's up a third from that. So this is how we build chords. We stack up thirds based on the notes of the scale. So major chords or triads are constructed from the 1, 3, and 5 of the major scale. So here's, again, is our C major scale. Here's the formula. The keys that the letters are on, those are the notes from the scale. That's where we land. Here's the scale notes. So our C major chord is the 1 and the 3 and the 5 of the C major scale. C, E, and G, we all know a C chord. So here's our C major chord. The 1, which is the root or the tonic, the 3rd and the 5th. We're stacking them up on thirds. Of course, there are 7 tones, chord tones in the scale. Oftentimes you'll see numbers in chord symbols. So for example, C6 chord. In our accompaniment 1 program, we teach that as adding a 4th note to the chord, a whole step above finger 5. So here's our C major chord. When we add a whole step above finger 5, well, that's just the 6th. That's the 6th note of the scale. So that's a 6 chord. The 6 just means the 6th note of the scale. Christine asked, does the 6th tone replace the 5th, or is it added to the other 3? In the accompaniment 1 program, Neil has it as adding a 4th note because he has a plus a whole step above the 5. It does not have to be played that way. Just to give you an example, another way to play it is to, in the left hand, play your root note, which we normally play on the bottom there. So for a C6, play finger 5 on your C in the left hand, and then you can move your thumb, left hand thumb, up a whole step. And that will be the 6th of the chord as well, which is the A. So you could just play a C chord in the right hand, and then the left hand plays a 1 and a 6, and that also is a 6th chord. That's just a different voicing, which we're going to talk a little bit about. So I hope that helps. I wondered with the 6th, if you could put the 5th on left hand, not for accompaniment 1 students, but for more advanced students. Absolutely. Then you'd have the 1, the 3, and the 6 in the right hand. For a C6, that would be C, E, and A. And then the left hand would play the C and the G, and that would give you a fuller sound. I would not teach it that way initially, is all I'm saying. So now we're going to talk about 7th chords. The next note, when we keep stacking up those thirds, is the 7th. So here's our 1, our 3, our 5, and now our 7. In the accompaniment 1 program, we teach 3 types of 7th chords. I think if you've all taught accompaniment, you know this. The 7th chord, the major 7th, and the minor 7th. I don't know if you are all familiar with dominant 7th, but the technical name for the 7th chord, the way we normally, the way we teach it in Amazing Grace, and then just whenever you see just a 7, C7 or E flat 7 or whatever, that technically is called a dominant 7th. We just shorten the name and say a 7th chord. The dominant 7, I don't want to get into this very deeply because it gets into some really gnarly theory stuff, but the dominant 7th is the 7th note of the major scale flatted. So in a C scale, the 7th note of the scale is the B. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's technically, that's the major 7. The dominant 7 is a B flat. So if you look at how we teach our 7th chords, we move the thumb down a whole step from the major chord. That lands you on a B flat. So that is the dominant 7. So when we say a 7th chord, I just want you to know that that is a dominant 7th chord. It includes an altered note from the major scale. Joan asked, why is this taught as a 3-note chord in Amazing Grace Foundation? There are different ways to play all of these chords. You could play a 7th chord, a C7 chord, by stacking up C, E, G, and then B flat on the top. That's just one way to play it. Neil has just created some really simple, quick ways to play all these 12 different chords that are easy to find. And that's a really quick and easy way to find it. We still have the 1 or the root or the tonic in the left hand when we're playing that bass note. We don't have to play it again in the right hand. Why is it called dominant? That's getting into some theory stuff that it's way beyond the scope of this. So for now, it's kind of like what you tell your students. Well, you don't really need to know that right now, and it'll just confuse the issue. So that's something for another discussion. Another question. Just curious, as I've been teaching C6 as a 3-note chord, and students with previous experience often show me the 7th chord as the 4-note chord. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with those. They're not wrong. Okay, it's just the way we teach them in a particular manner. And again, all of the way we teach all of those chords is one way, it's one option for playing those chords. We're just giving them something quick that they can play in a song. Is it okay to teach it either way? I would say no. I would say stick to the accompaniment program and teach them the way that they are presented in the chord chart with the triangles. Later on is when I would get into, there are other ways to play this chord. With the 6th chord, adding the 4th note, you could do a 3-note chord, but actually that'll then sound more like an A minor chord without that 5 in there. So I would just stick with the chord chart in the accompaniment book and teach it exactly the way Neil has it in there. Just as someone asked about the 6th, should you account for all the notes of the chords between the 2 hands? That depends on the chord. You don't have to have every single chord tone in the chord, especially when we get into some of the more involved extended chords. But I mean, a C in the left hand and a C and an E in the right hand is still a C chord. If you have all of the chord tones in, especially just a major or minor or one of those simpler chords, you hear the essence of the chord more fully if you're playing all of the chord tones somewhere. Seventh chords are really important in jazz music. They provide the building blocks of harmony. So I'm not going to get into the jazz program so much today, but I want you to be able to understand something about the chords. When we continue stacking the thirds, again, above the seventh, then those are called extended chords. And those are your 9th chords, 11th chords, and 13th chords. So here's our 1, 3, 5, and 7. And then here we've stacked 3 more thirds on top of those. And so those are the 9th, the 11th, and the 13th. And by the way, if you went up 1 more third, a 15th, you're back to your 1. You're back to C. I just want to be very clear that you would not play a 13th chord like this. You wouldn't play all of these notes. It would just sound silly. This is basically just showing you the chord tones that will work in a 13th chord. All of these chord tones can be present in a 13th chord. In an 11th chord, starting with that 11th, anything from the 11th and below are chord tones that work in an 11th chord. A 9th chord, anything from the 9th below works in a 9th chord. Another thing about the 9th, 11th, and 13th is that they are just an octave higher than the 2nd, 4th, and 6th. I know that might be a little confusing right now. I'm going to say a little bit more about that later. When we start going up the keyboard again, here's our major scale, and here's our scale tones. So we have our 1. These are the bold numbers are our chord tones. 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, and 13. So the 9 is the 2, an octave higher. It doesn't mean you have to play it an octave higher. There's just some rules that I'll go over that will help this make sense. The 11 is just the 4, an octave higher. The 13 is the 6, an octave higher. So this is how jazz chords are built. Extended chords, again, 9th, 11th, and 13th chords. This is one of those rules you just got to know. An extended chord must include the 7th and the named extension, either the 9, 11, or 13. It may include any of the chord tones in between, if there are any. So the examples, a 9th chord must include a 7th and a 9th. An 11th chord must include a 7 and an 11 because that's the named extension, but it may include a 9th, doesn't have to. 13th chord must include the 7th and 13th, and it may include a 9 and or an 11. So I hope that rule, if it's like, sounds like, if you go back and look at this, it'll make sense. Okay, I'm gonna take a couple questions here. Christine asked, in the extended chord example, we use the straight 7th tone, not a flatted 7th tone. No, in fact, I'm gonna be getting into that on the next slide. Here we go. You were one step ahead of me. The 7 in extended chords is always dominant. That means it's flatted unless it indicates otherwise. And by the way it's indicated is if you see a major 9 chord, a major 11 chord, or a major 13, I don't know if I've ever seen one of those, that is referring to the 7. That means you're playing a major 7, not a dominant 7. A chord which includes one of those tones, a 9, 11, or 13, but no 7 is a chord with an added extension. And this is a very common question here. A C9 chord has to include the 7th. A C add 9 includes the 9 or the 2, but it does not include the 7th. sometimes you'll see that referred to as a C add 2 chord. It's the same thing. The add 9 means you're adding that scale tone to the chord and not playing the 7th. So just to recap, extended chords are 9th chords, 11th chords, and 13th chords. They have to include the dominant 7th or the 7th, which is always dominant unless it is otherwise noted. When we add an extension, the difference between an extended chord and an added extension is there's no 7 in the added extension chord. I trust some of you probably are familiar with chord voicing or what that means, and some of you maybe haven't heard that before. And all it is just different ways of playing the same chord. Playing this note an octave higher or an octave lower, or omitting a chord tone from a chord, or just different combinations of the possible chord tones in a chord. In accompaniment 1, like I said before, we're teaching one simple voicing of each of those chords. There are other ways to play those chords, but we're just, remember, in a playing-based environment, in the accompaniment program, we're just getting chords into their hands so that they can apply it quickly. So we're not going to go into all this stuff where we're explaining the scale degrees and inversions and different ways of playing the chords. We just want them to get the chords quickly into their hands so they can play music with them. So here's some examples. I think this is what really helps to bring this home, because these are from chords that you know, and you'll be able to see how they're made up. Here's our chord tones: 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13. I'm doing all these as C chords because I'm going to show you the actual notes in the chord. A C add 9, so it's an add 9, so there's no 7 in it. We teach as adding an extra note to the chord, a whole step above the 1. The plus means you're adding a 4th note to the chord. And here's what that looks like if you were to see it written out. It's one of those bunch chords we use in arrangements all the time. And these are the scale degrees that are in this chord. So you're playing the 1 in the left hand always. The right hand, we have the C, which is a 1. The D here is the 9 that we're adding, and then the 3 and the 5. So that one's pretty straightforward. Now let's look at an 11th chord, because a lot of people ask, why isn't it just a B flat chord over C? Because this is just one simple voicing, one way to play an 11th chord that you can use and it'll sound great. So we just take the whole chord from C in the right hand and move it down a whole step. That just makes it a B flat chord. So our chord tones here, we have our 1 in the left hand, the C, because it's a C chord built on the C scale. We have our dominant 7, the flatted 7, because it's an extended chord. We have our 9 and we have our 11. So there's lots of different ways to play 11 chords. This is just a really quick and simple one that gives it an 11th chord sound, and it's easy to find. One more is the 13th chord, and the way we teach this in accompaniment 1 is to move finger 1 down a whole step, finger 5 up a whole step. So let's look at what we have going on there. This is the notes we would be playing, and these are the scale degrees we're playing. 1 in the left hand, and we've got our 7. When we move our thumb down a whole step, that's the dominant flatted 7. We retained our 3, and then when we moved finger 5 up a whole step, that's the 13. I was just going to say a few things about chord alterations. And this is just when we change a note in a chord to a note that is not a naturally occurring note in the scale. I see questions about these a lot in the jazz program. Flat 9 means flat the 9. So if you're playing that 9 note anywhere in the chord, if it was a C 11 flat 9 or something, then you would have in your voicing, if you have a D anywhere in there, because the D is the ninth in the C scale, you would play a D flat instead of a D. Same with sharp. It's the same, sharp 5 means sharp the 5. It's really that straightforward. This is mostly in the jazz program, but like, for example, I think there's a chord in there somewhere that's a G sharp minor 7 flat 5. I just say read it left to right. G sharp, same as A flat, okay? Play a G sharp major chord. Minor 7, how do you do a minor 7? They know, they've learned that, at that point. Finger 3 down a half step, finger 1 down a whole step. Flat 5. So then we just look at it and go, well, is there a 5 anywhere in this chord? And then if there is, we flat it. So we just read it left to right and apply the instructions. That's pretty much my approach. Christine asks, so the C11 doesn't have to contain the ninth. That is just one option. Correct. That is correct, because the extended chords must include a seventh and they must include the named extension. So it can include a ninth. It has to have an 11 and a 7, but it doesn't have to have the ninth. Joan asked, the add 9 is not called an add 2 because it's not one of the chord tones. Well, I remember Neil has done that in different ways in the accompaniment book. It used to say add 2, and then it said add 9, and he had a little note that could be a source of contention. And either one of them is fine. Okay, Sandy asked, I wonder if you could tell about sus2 and sus4 and how you know when it should be both at the same time. Okay, that's a good question. So we teach suspended chord in accompaniment 1. The suspended chord that we teach is the sus4. We're moving finger 3 up a half step, and that's the 4th tone of the scale, so it's a suspended 4. The suspended chord always your ear wants it to resolve back to the 3. So from the C, F, and G, it wants to resolve either to a C major chord or a C minor chord. A suspended 2 chord, we don't teach in the accompaniment 1 program, but I teach it a lot because it pops up a lot in music. It's a different type of suspended chord. And in that one, we move finger 3 down a whole step. A suspended chord does not have a 3 in it. So a C suspended 2 would be a C, a D, and a G. And that also wants to resolve to the 3. It kind of wants to lead up to the 3. There are sometimes chords that have both of those, the 1, 2, 4, and 5. And I believe the way that's usually notated is C sus 2/4. Maureen asked, in referring specifically to Elizabeth Gaikwad's Songs for Christmas, she has some chords that say add 9. I mean the word add spelled out, ADD 9, and some that say plus 9. They're the same thing then? Yes, they are. So the plus sign is just an add 9. Opala asked, do you start the jazz program before accompaniment 2? I do, some people don't. That's what it says in the teacher training. But they kind of, as far as accompaniment rhythms, cover some of the same ground. I start with jazz program before I start accompaniment 2. Not everybody does.
Did you want to address, because I don't know if other people have encountered it, the diminished 7 that we encounter in the jazz program?
Yeah, for a diminished 7 chord, you can think of it as stacking up the 1, 3, 5, and 7 of a dominant 7 chord, and then flatting the 3, the 5, and the 7. So, for example, a C diminished 7, if you started from the dominant 7 chord, it would be C, E, G, and B flat. And then flatting the 3, 5, and 7, you would end up with C, E flat, G flat, and A, or technically B double flat.
So your invitation to ask questions about the jazz book, I grabbed the jazz book because I know I do get confused about things, but I think you've already answered it. So the B minor 7 and then a -5 is the B minor 7 flat 5, basically. I've seen it elsewhere as B minor 7 flat 5. And I think I was confused about that, but I'm not confused anymore. So I just want to verify with you. Thank you.
Yeah, so a flat 9, you might see a minus sign and then a 9, or you might see a flat symbol and then a 9. Same thing.
Theoretically, I understand these chords, but I often find it really hard to make them sound jazzy, make them sound really cool, past the kind of basic stuff. I'm not sure when that would come in.
And have you taught jazz clues?
No, not yet.
Okay, well, he does. That's one of the jazz clues. There are 4 jazz clues taught in the program, and the 3rd jazz clue is all about voicing. Again, I don't want to say it's limited, but he teaches just specific voicings that sound really great and sound really jazzy. But just with the knowledge of how they're constructed, you don't have to be limited to any one voicing.